The phone rang at 6:20 in the morning, which was unusual for my son-in-law because he knew I was always awake before sunrise, but also knew better than to call before the day had properly started. I was already in the kitchen with a mug of coffee in my hand, standing at the back window and watching the thin silver crust of frost over the lawn catch the first week light. December in Kentucky has a way of making everything look brittle. The grass, the fence rails, the sky. Even the quiet feels fragile that time of year. When I saw his name on the screen, something in my chest tightened. Not panic exactly, more like the feeling you get when a floorboard creaks in an otherwise silent house. I answered on the second ring. He didn't bother easing into it. He said he had to leave town unexpectedly, a work emergency, a site issue in Phoenix. Some contractor had gone sideways on a commercial project, and his company needed him on a plane that afternoon and on the ground in Arizona by Monday morning. He said it quickly, in that efficient way people speak when they've already decided what the answer will be and only need your mouth to catch up. Then he said he needed me to keep my grandson for the week. He said he'd bring him by Sunday evening. He said he appreciated it. He said he knew it was short notice. I said, "Of course." I said, "Bring him over." Then we hung up. I stood at the window a while longer after that and finished my coffee, watching the frost and thinking that I ought to feel more pleased than I did. I loved my grandson. I always had. And since my daughter died, I had seen far less of him than I wanted. My son-in-law and I had settled into the kind of civility that often grows between two men, linked only by a person who is no longer there. Not warm, not openly hostile, just careful, polite. A narrow bridge neither of us trusted, but both of us kept crossing because the alternative was uglier. I lived 25 minutes north of Lexington in the same brick house I'd owned for 33 years, on a quiet road where people still brought casseroles when someone died and still waved from the end of the drive even if they didn't particularly like you. He lived closer to town now, in a rented place near Nicholasville Road, after selling the house my daughter had loved. I was a retired fire captain. 34 years on the job. I had carried people out of kitchens full of smoke, climbed stairwells in buildings that should never have been cleared for occupancy, seen parents make impossible choices, and children survive things they should never have known how to survive. I had spent enough time inside other people's disasters that I believed I was difficult to surprise. I was wrong. My son-in-law pulled into the driveway that Sunday at exactly 6 o'clock. He didn't come to the door. He parked at the curb, got out, lifted a single duffel bag from the boot, and handed it to my grandson on the pavement. He bent and said something to the boy I couldn't hear from the porch. Then he got back into the car, gave me a short wave through the windscreen, and was gone before I'd made it down the front steps. No lingering, no coffee, no quick conversation, not even the performance of one. My grandson stood on the pavement with the duffel hanging from one shoulder. He was 9 years old, and the first thing I noticed was that he looked smaller than the last time I had seen him. That is never how it's supposed to work. Children are meant to look bigger every time you go too long without seeing them. Taller, louder, more themselves. He looked diminished. He had on a jacket too thin for the cold and trainers that were worn badly at the toes. He looked up at me and smiled, but it was the kind of smile that seemed to arrive by instruction rather than by feeling. Neat, careful, practiced. I walked down, took the duffel from his hand, put my palm lightly on his shoulder, and told him it was good to see him. He said it was good to see me too, softly, politely, like a child speaking in a room where noise was expensive. I brought him inside and showed him to the guest room, which had once been his mother's room when she was a teenager, though the walls were painted now and the old furniture long gone. He stood in the doorway and looked around without touching anything. I told him to make himself at home. I told him dinner would be in about an hour. I told him I was making roasted chicken and rice because I remembered it was one of his favorites. He said, "Thank you." Then he sat on the edge of the bed with both hands in his lap and did not unpack the bag. I left him to settle in and went back to the kitchen. Dinner was the first sign. I set the table and called him down. He came immediately, which surprised me. Children that age usually need calling twice, sometimes 3 times if they're happy. He sat down without dragging the chair, put the napkin in his lap without being asked, waited. I served him chicken, rice, green beans, and a roll. He looked at the plate. He did not pick up the fork. I sat down across from him and said, "Go on, buddy, eat." Still nothing. He stared at the food with an expression I couldn't name at the time. Not dislike, not confusion, something more deliberate. I asked if something was wrong. I asked if he wanted the green beans off. Then he looked up at me and said very quietly, "Do I get all of it?" I didn't understand the question. I actually thought for a second that I had misheard him. "All of what?" He glanced down. "The plate." I said, "Yes, of course." "Why wouldn't you?" He looked back at the food, picked up his fork, and started eating slowly, carefully, the way someone might move through a set of instructions they had learned not to violate. I told myself it was nothing. Children say odd things all the time. They hear phrases wrong. They carry rules from one house into another. They ask questions adults don't expect. I told myself a lot of things that evening. He ate every bite. Then he folded his hands in his lap and sat still again. I asked if he wanted more. He looked up with something that was almost fear. Then it disappeared behind politeness. "Is that allowed?" I remember the exact feeling I had then. Not full understanding. Just the first hard knock from it. I said, "Of course it is." I loaded his plate again. He ate that too. He ate like someone who was not certain the next meal would happen if he did not take full advantage of the one in front of him. That night, while I washed dishes, I stood at the sink thinking about the question. Do I get all of it? I tried on innocent explanations. Maybe his father had him on some rigid nutrition plan. Maybe he was asking if the food was all for him because he thought I hadn't served myself yet. Maybe it was just one of those odd, contextless child questions. But the explanations felt thin even while I built them, because his face had not looked like the face of a child asking something silly. It had looked like the face of a child checking a rule. The next morning, I made pancakes. He came downstairs at 7:30 already dressed, shoes on, hair brushed, as if lateness carried consequences. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table where I had set out butter, syrup, bacon, orange juice, and a stack of pancakes on a warm plate. His face did something I will never forget. A quick tightening around the mouth, a flicker in the eyes. The body trying to understand whether this was safe. I told him to sit down. He sat. I put 3 pancakes on a plate, added bacon, and set a glass of juice beside it. He looked at the plate for a long moment. Then he looked up at me and asked, "All 3?" I put down the spatula and sat across from him. He had my daughter's dark eyes, her way of lowering her chin when she felt uncertain. There are moments when resemblance hurts. This was one of them. I asked him gently how often he ate breakfast at home. He said, "Sometimes." I asked what sometimes meant. He looked at the plate. "So just depends." "Depends on what?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Whether Dad's in a bad mood." I kept my voice even. I asked what happened when his dad was in a bad mood. He said, "Stuff changes." I asked what that meant. He didn't answer right away. He just held the fork over the pancakes, then set it back down. Then he said that sometimes dinner got skipped. Sometimes breakfast was just dry toast. Sometimes his dad forgot. And sometimes he didn't remind him, because reminding him made things worse. I asked what worse looked like. He was silent for so long I thought he might stop talking altogether. Then he said his dad shouted a lot. He said sometimes things got locked away. He said that once, after he'd asked for cereal in the evening, His dad moved all the food into the garage and put a padlock on the door and said it was time he learned that nothing in life was free. I asked when that happened. He said, "Last year. Last year, 4 months after my daughter was buried. I told him to eat his pancakes. I told him he could have as many as he wanted. I told him I had enough batter for 10 more if he was hungry. I told him he could have more bacon, more juice, more anything in that kitchen. I kept my voice calm because calm is how you keep children from feeling responsible for your alarm. But something was happening in my chest that I recognized from my years on the job. A very specific anger. The kind that comes when you realize someone small has been made to live inside someone else's cruelty. He ate 4 pancakes, finished the bacon, drank 2 glasses of orange juice. Then he said, with real feeling in his voice, "Thanks, Granddad." And I said, "That's what breakfast is for." After that, once I had seen the pattern, I saw it everywhere. He asked permission before sitting down on the sofa. He asked permission before switching on the television. He asked if he was allowed to pour himself water. Every question came with the same tiny brace in the shoulders, the same waiting look, as if each request carried risk. He did not go into the garden without asking. He did not open a cupboard without asking. He did not touch the dog's ball without asking. And when I told him he didn't need to ask about ordinary things in my house, he looked at me with actual confusion. On Tuesday afternoon, I helped him change into a dry jumper after he got wet in the garden, and that was when I saw the bruising on his upper arm. It was old enough to be yellowing, but not old enough to be mistaken for anything else. 4 marks. Adult fingers. I asked him what happened. He said he bumped into a door. I said, "All right." Then I handed him the dry jumper and said nothing more. That night, after he was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time with no light on except the one above the stove. I thought about my daughter, about the last year of her life, about whether she had known, about whether I had missed something while she was still alive because I was too careful or too trusting or too willing to let another man run his own house badly as long as I was not asked to enter it. I don't believe she knew. She would have told me. She was not built for silence where harm was concerned. I thought about my son-in-law, whom I had known for 11 years. A man who had seemed decent enough in the way men can seem decent, while the woman who loves them is still in the room translating their sharpness into stress, their control into responsibility, their moods into understandable fatigue. I thought about grief. And then I thought about how grief had no business leaving finger marks on a 9-year-old's arm. I rang him Wednesday morning. I asked how Phoenix was. He said, "Fine. Exhausting." I said I wanted to talk when he got back, that everything was all right with the boy, but there were some things I needed to discuss face to face. He said, "Sure. Friday evening." After I hung up, I sat still and considered the shape of the week. Then I rang the school. It was autumn break, which was part of why he'd asked me to keep the child in the first place. No classes meant no school structure, no breakfast program, no teachers watching. I spoke first to the receptionist, then to his form teacher. I will tell you that what she said did not surprise me. It saddened me. It angered me. It confirmed what I had already begun to know. But it did not surprise me. She told me she had noticed things over several months. He hoarded food from lunch, rolls in his pockets, crackers in his pencil case, fruit hidden in his desk. She said there were mornings he came in clearly hungry, and she had taken to keeping cereal bars in her drawer for him without making a fuss. She said he was a polite child, very obedient, but that there was a heaviness to his obedience that did not feel like manners so much as fear. I asked if the school had reported it. She paused. Then she said yes. A report had been made to Child Services in September. A caseworker had visited. The father had presented well. The child had not disclosed enough. The case had been closed. That, too, did not surprise me. Men who know how to perform competence are often protected by it. I told her I was aware now and that I intended to act. She said she was relieved. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat in the kitchen looking out at the frost on the grass, which had returned overnight. My grandson had eaten 2 full bowls of cereal that morning. He had poured his own milk, carried his bowl to the sink, and looked faintly ashamed of having enjoyed himself. Small things, ordinary things, things that in context became evidence. I rang my GP, who was also an old friend, and asked him what the correct steps were. He told me to document everything, photograph the bruise with the child's awareness and consent, ring the child abuse hotline, and contact a family law solicitor before my son-in-law returned. So I did. I spent most of Wednesday making calls. I took the photograph after explaining to my grandson that I needed to do something to help keep him safe. He nodded in the solemn, overcomposed way he had, as if safety were a practical matter to be filled out correctly. Thursday, we built a birdhouse. I had bought a kit years earlier and never used it. He found it in the garage while I was looking for a screwdriver and held it up with the first real spark of excitement I had seen in him all week. So we laid the pieces out on the workbench and sanded the edges and fitted the sides and talked very little. He was good with his hands, patient, careful, curious once he forgot to be afraid. At one point he asked if I used to build things with my dad. I said no. My father had not been much of a builder. I told him I'd mostly taught myself. He nodded and kept sanding. Then, after a minute, he said his dad used to do things with him too, back when he was little. Park trips, baseball in the garden, Saturday pancakes. I said that sounded like a good memory. He said his dad was different now. He said it had started when his mom got sick, but got much worse after she died. He said he knew his dad was sad. He really did know that. He understood sad. But sometimes it felt like his dad was angry at him instead of at the sad thing. I kept sanding. I told him that sometimes adults who were very hurt and had not gotten help for it made choices they shouldn't make. I told him very clearly that none of those choices were ever the child's fault. He was silent. Then he said, "He says I cost too much." I put the sandpaper down. He went on quietly, as if reporting weather, that his dad had credit card debt, that money was tight, that he talked a lot about burden, that when he was really angry, he stopped using his name and called him expense, or problem, or once, burden. I picked up the sandpaper again because I did not want my face to do what it wanted to do. I said no parent should ever say that. I said he was not a burden. I said he was the most important thing in a very long list of important things in this world, and that his mother had loved him more than anything she had ever loved, and that whatever his father was failing to manage in himself did not change the boy's value by 1 inch. He looked at me for a long time. Then he went back to sanding. We painted the birdhouse blue that afternoon because it was his choice. Hung it on the fence. He stood looking at it with both hands in his pockets and said very softly that it was the best thing he had ever made. I told him it was the best thing I had made all week, too. My son-in-law called Friday morning to say he'd be there by 5. He sounded tired and brittle. I told him everything had gone fine. That was true, in a way. By then, I had spoken with a family solicitor and filed a formal report with the abuse hotline. I had photographs, notes, dates, direct statements, the school contact, and enough concern from multiple angles that this would not be dismissed as one overprotective grandfather's imagination. The solicitor had also told me something important. Because my daughter had died without updating several legal arrangements, and because there were no stronger protective orders already in place, I had more standing than I realized to seek emergency temporary guardianship. Friday afternoon, I sat my grandson down in the sitting room before his father arrived. I told him I had been listening all week. I told him some of what he had said were things adults whose job was to keep children safe needed to know about. I told him I had already spoken to those adults. I told him that he was not in any trouble at all, and that whatever happened next, he would not be alone in it. He was very still. Then he asked, "Are you going to tell Dad you called?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. Okay. I asked if he was scared. He thought about it. Then he said, a little, but also relieved. Then he said he felt bad for feeling relieved. I told him relieved was exactly the right thing to feel. I told him relief meant that somewhere inside himself, he already knew things should have been different, and that knowing was healthy. He said okay. Then he asked if he could have a snack before his dad got there. I said absolutely. He chose an apple with peanut butter, which had been his favorite since he was 4. He sat at the table eating it while I sat across from him, and neither of us talked much. I was glad he was there. His father arrived at 4:58. He looked older than the last time I had seen him. Thinner, hollow around the eyes, the posture of a man who had been living badly inside himself for too long. I let him in. I told my grandson to go upstairs for a while because I needed to talk privately with his father. He went without argument, his footsteps quiet on the stairs. My son-in-law watched him go. Then he looked at me and said, "Everything all right?" I said, "Sit down." Something changed in his face. He sat. I told him calmly what I had seen over the course of the week. The food questions, the grip bruise, the compulsive permission-seeking, the school reports, the things his son had said. Then I told him I had already filed a formal report, spoken to an attorney, and would be pursuing emergency guardianship unless the professionals involved advised otherwise. He said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "You don't understand." I said I understood that he was grieving. I understood that losing my daughter had broken something in him. I understood that money pressure was real. I understood that the past year had likely been the hardest of his life. I also said none of that excused hunger or bruises or teaching a child to fear his own plate. He put his face in his hands. He said he hadn't meant for it to become what it had become. He said there were days he could see himself clearly and hated what he saw but still did not know how to stop being it. I asked him about his own father. He looked up sharply. I said I was asking because patterns like the ones I had seen rarely come out of nowhere. He was silent a long time. Then he said his father had been, in the family phrase, a hard man. He said that was how everyone described him, as if hardness were a weather pattern instead of a choice. He said food and comfort and safety had all been conditional in that house. Earned, withheld, rationed, weaponized. He said he had sworn his whole adult life that he would never be his father. I told him it seemed some of his father had remained in him anyway, waiting for grief and stress to pull the right switch. He said he knew. Then I laid out where we were. Child services would be following up. The solicitor would be filing for emergency temporary guardianship in my favor. He could contest it, and if he did, the process would become longer and harder and uglier for everyone. Or he could agree to a temporary arrangement, enter treatment, begin therapy with someone qualified in trauma and abusive family patterns, take parenting classes, and work toward earning back the right to be trusted. I made it clear this was not revenge. I was not trying to erase him from the boy's life. I was trying to interrupt a pattern before it finished what it had started. He asked, very quietly, "Does he hate me?" I said no. I said the boy had told me that morning that he knew his dad was sad and that he hoped his dad got better. I said he was 9 years old and already carrying more generosity than most adults manage in a lifetime. Something broke in his face then. Not theatrically, not all at once. Quietly. He cried at my kitchen table. I let him. Some grief is legitimate even when the behavior it produces is not. I got 2 glasses of water and set one in front of him. After a while, he wiped his face and said he needed time to think. I told him he could take the night. I told him his son would stay here tonight regardless. Then he asked if he could say goodbye before he left. I called my grandson downstairs. He came slowly and stopped near the bottom step. His father looked at him across the room, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then his father said, in a rough, unsteady voice, that he was sorry. He said he knew sorry wasn't enough. He said he was going to get help. He said he wanted to be better. My grandson looked at him a long time. Then he walked across the room, not close enough to touch, but closer than before, and said, "Okay, Dad." That was all. 2 words. Enough for a lifetime. His father left at 6:15. The weeks that followed were not simple. Child Protective Services conducted a full investigation. They interviewed my grandson with a trained specialist. They reviewed the school concerns. They reviewed the photos. They spoke with neighbors who, it turned out, had heard more than they had ever said. The solicitor filed the emergency application. Temporary guardianship was granted in my favor. His father did not fight it. That mattered more to me than people might think. He entered treatment, trauma therapy, parenting classes, a program specifically for men who had repeated abusive patterns learned in childhood. 3 sessions a week at first, then more as recommended. It was expensive and inconvenient and humiliating. He did not miss one. A formal child support arrangement was set through the court. It was not a large amount initially because his finances were a mess, but it was structured, binding, and enforceable. His son was no longer an optional expense in his thinking. My grandson moved properly into the guest room. He unpacked slowly over the course of 3 weeks. First the school books, then the toy cars, then the blue blanket, then the photograph of his mother, which he put on the bedside table without comment. He stopped asking permission before sitting down. He stopped flinching when I entered a room unexpectedly. He started eating 3 regular meals a day, and after about a month he stopped eating as if the meal might vanish while he was chewing it. He started leaving small messes in the kitchen, and I made a point not to comment on them because one of the skills he needed most was learning that ordinary mistakes did not have to summon danger. By the 3rd week, he slept through the night. We built 3 more birdhouses before Christmas, hung them along the back fence and in the apple tree. By January, there were 4 kinds of birds visiting, and he began keeping a little notebook about them. He had his mother's handwriting, small, tidy, slightly tilted. The supervised visits with his father started in February. They were awkward at first, which was proper. Trust is not a thing children owe on a schedule that suits adults. His father showed up early each time. He brought books, a proper baseball glove, the specific salt and vinegar crisps the boy liked, little things that said he was paying attention in ways he had failed to before. He was careful, not performative, not grand. Careful. And because children are wise in ways that frighten me sometimes, my grandson noticed that before he trusted it. He watched his father with quiet eyes. He said very little for the first few visits. Then a little more. Then more. I am not going to tell you that everything became simple and golden after that. That is not how these stories go. What I will tell you is that in early spring, I stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee and watched them in the back garden throwing a baseball. Back and forth, not talking much, just throwing. The kind of silence that sometimes exists between a father and a son when both of them are trying very hard to be careful with each other. My grandson caught one high overhand throw, held the ball in his glove for a moment, then tossed it back. And standing there, I thought about my daughter, about the fact that she had loved both of them fiercely, about what she would have felt seeing them like that, about whether grief, interrupted in time, can become something other than inheritance. I thought about cycles, about the weather systems that move through families generation after generation, the same storm taking different shapes, landing in new children who had no part in making it. I thought about my son-in-law's father, and that man's father before him, and the long chain of unexamined damage passed down like cutlery at supper, and I thought about where it stops. That is the answer in the end. It stops where someone interrupts it, not with speeches, not with miracles, not with dramatic courtroom justice. It stops when somebody notices. It stops when somebody asks the right question. It stops when a teacher quietly keeps crackers in her desk. When a grandfather hears the wrong question at dinner and does not look away. When a man in his worst hour is offered not forgiveness for free, but a non-negotiable path toward better. It stops on a plain Tuesday morning when a child pours himself cereal without asking and eats it with both shoulders loose because he has finally learned that breakfast will still exist tomorrow. My grandson asked me once, late that autumn, why I had called those people. By then, he understood enough to mean child services, the solicitor, all of it. I told him the truth. I said because grown-ups are supposed to do something when they know a child needs help. I said I was sorry it had taken a full week at my house for me to act, and sorrier still that I had not looked closer before that. I told him that was something I would have to live with. He thought about it. Then he said he was glad I had called. I said I was glad he had told me what he told me. He said, "It was because you seemed like you really wanted to know." I said, "I did. I always will." He nodded. Then he went back to his bird journal and wrote something down in his neat, slanted hand, and I went back to my coffee, and the morning moved on around us in the ordinary way mornings do once the emergency inside them has finally been named. There is a blue birdhouse at the far end of the fence. Sometimes I look at it in the early light and think about the week we built it, about the boy who chose the color, about the way he sanded the edges so carefully, about everything neither of us knew how to say directly that somehow got said anyway. I am 66 years old. I have carried people out of burning houses. I have stood in smoke and waiting rooms and funerals. I have watched grief deform good people and harden already damaged ones. I have made my share of mistakes. But that week I did the right thing, and I will tell you something plain from the far side of it. Doing the right thing is rarely complicated. Usually it is just the thing you already know you must do, sitting quietly in the room while you gather the nerve to do it. He is 9 years old now, and he eats his pancakes.